Hey guys, and welcome to MTGHQ. My name is Sean, and I'm going to be going through one of my other EDH decks today. Now, just a foreshadowing, this is a Vendilion Clique deck. Typically, a Vendilion Clique deck is going to be a competitive deck, and that's exactly what this is. Now, for all those out there that think EDH and competitive should not be in the same sentence at all, let alone in the same universe or anything like that, I'm just going to say this. EDH is vastly growing to be a more and more competitive environment as we see side events popping up in GPs, opens, anything that you go to these days, you're going to find competitive EDH pods. So occasionally it makes sense to have one of these decks around. And I know a lot of you guys have been asking for a budget EDH deck, and I'm going to get to that a little bit later. But this deck is strictly intended to be a best as it can get for a mono blue deck. Now there's also going to be some cards in here that some people may say you should be running this if you're ultra competitive, or you should be running that. Now a couple of those cards, which I will mention while I go through here, I chose not to run because they either are just a little bit extra or they are just a win more card, and I'm more trying to focus on actually winning the game instead of just having amazing cards. So as you can see, my commander here is going to be Vendilion Clique. I did happen to get a judge promo of this version, or of this card, because I thought it was just extra sweet looking. So as you know, Vendilion Clique has flash, has flying. It's a 3/1 for 3, and when it enters the battlefield, you can look at target player's hand. You can either target yourself or one of your opponents, and you can choose a non-land card from it. If you do, that player reveals the chosen card, puts it on the bottom of their library, and then draws a card. So now we're going to start off by running through the lands in this deck. Now, as with almost every other EDH deck that I play, I run exactly 36 lands. This deck is going to be no different. We're going to start off by having exactly 34 basic islands. Now, in my last video that I did a monocolor deck, which was Ashling, it was mentioned to me why not run snow-covered mountains, so that way I can use Extraplanar Lens and Gauntlet of Power, or I can use not Gauntlet of Power, but I could at least use Extraplanar Lens and only get the benefit for myself. While I could do that, I instead am opting for I like my full art islands, I like my full art mountains. I'm going to go for what I think looks best, and if my opponent gets a little bit of help off of it, well, I can usually make up for that in the end. The only non-basics I'm going to be running are going to be Academy Ruins and a Reliquary Tower. Reliquary Tower, you have no maximum hand size and it taps for 1. Pretty self-explanatory. Academy Ruins, on the other hand, can tap for 1, and then for a colorless, a blue, and itself, you can put target artifact card from your graveyard on top of your library. Very useful for recursion of your artifacts if you're going up against somebody that happens to have a lot of artifact hate in their deck. Next up, I want to talk about the creatures. We're going to go in order of casting cost here. To start off, we're going to go with a Cloud of Fairies, which does pair well with another card that you're going to see a little bit later called Deadeye Navigator. Basically, when it comes into play, you can untap 2 lands. It itself has flying, it's a 2-drop, it's a 1/1, and you can cycle it for 2 colorless mana. The next 2-drop we're going to have is Gilded Drake. It's a 3/3 flyer, and when Gilded Drake comes into play, you can exchange control of Gilded Drake for target creature one of your opponent's controls, or sacrifice Gilded Drake. So, pretty good card in almost every single situation that you played. Either you're going to get something that you wish you had, or you're going to take something away that your opponent really wants to have. Laboratory Maniac is just a general win condition card. He's not here for anything else, and if you would, while he's on the field, if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead, because typically you would lose at that point. This is pretty much what this deck is trying to do. It's either going to be trying to draw all of its cards, or a couple of other win cons do exist in the deck. But this is one of the main ways to do it. Another 3-drop is going to be Thada Adel Acquisitor. It has Island Walk, it's a 2/2, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can search that player's library for an artifact card and exile it. And then that player shuffles their library, and until the end of turn you can play that card. So typically this is where you would go and get either a Soul Ring or a Mana Vault or something along those lines to, help yourself out with more mana, or you could look for something that's going to protect you a little bit more, because we're not very creature heavy in this deck. Moving on to the 4-drops, we're just going to have a Clever Impersonator. All around, this card doesn't even end up being a creature most of the time. It's just meant to be a copy of a permanent on the field. So let's say my opponent has something that is making them draw more. Well, I'm going to want the same exact thing. Or if they have something that makes it so we can't attack them, well, I don't want people to attack me either, again, because of my low creature count. So it's basically there to steal whatever is out there that I could use at that moment in time. Next 4-drop is Phyrexian Metamorph. Essentially serves the same exact purpose as Clever Impersonator, although it's just a little bit of a step down. It can copy creatures and artifacts, but not any other type of permanent. Peregrine Drake is going to serve a similar purpose to Cloud of Fairies. When it comes in, you can untap 5 lands. It itself is a flying 2/3 for 5. So if you have a mana doubler out there like Extraplanar Lens or Gauntlet of Power or Cage Sun, you can tap 5 lands, add 10 mana, then cast Peregrine Drake, untap all 5 of those lands, and then add more to end up netting 15 mana just by playing this one spell. Psychosis Crawler is the next 5-drop. Its power and toughness equal the number of cards in your hand, which typically will actually be a lot whenever you play this deck. And whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. Now, again, very powerful. As we saw before, the Laboratory Maniac I do run as a win condition to draw all the cards in my deck, but if I can't get Laboratory Maniac in time, putting Psychosis Crawler out and then drawing 40 cards is an easy way to win an EDH game. 6-drop Deadeye Navigator. This is the one that I was saying pretty much makes it happen with the Cloud of Fairies and the Peregrine Drake. There's also a couple other cards out there like Great Whale and Palinchron that do essentially the same exact thing. Palinchron, however, on its card itself, actually has its own ability to bounce itself. But Deadeye Navigator makes it so you only have to pay 2 mana. So if you have a Peregrine Drake out there or a Great Whale out there, and you have 2 mana open after you cast Deadeye Navigator, then that's infinite mana all by itself by flickering the Great Whale over and over again and tapping your lands in response. So you don't need a mana doubler as long as you have one of those creatures. If you have the Cloud of Fairies, though, you will need a mana doubler in order to get infinite loop. Consecrated Sphinx, really solid creature to have in any blue deck, period. It's a 6-drop for a 4/6 as flying, and whenever an opponent draws a card, you may draw 2 cards. Now, note that it is a may. You're not going to deck yourself accidentally with this card. You could choose to not draw. All in all, though, it matches along with the theme of what we want to be doing in this competitive EDH deck. Sphinx of the Final Word is a relatively newer creature that I happened upon and thought this would be good in a deck where I want to make sure that I'm the one that's in control. It can't be countered when you cast it. It has flying, it has hexproof, and my instant sorcery spells can't be countered by spells or abilities. I could not ask for a better partner in crime when it comes to a creature card in this deck. Moving on to another 7-drop is Memnarch. This is generally my favorite way to win a game. It can be a little bit slower, but it's a little bit more tangible to continue going with Memnarch than it is to, say, sticking with either a Laboratory Maniac win or Psychosis Crawler win. For 7 mana, it can turn any non-artifact permanent into an artifact and then gain control of it. And for 4, it just gains control of target artifact. So if you can make a bunch of mana, but you don't have a way to draw cards, Memnarch is going to be the guy that wins the game for you. He can steal lands, he can steal creatures, he can steal pretty much anything, as long as you have the mana to turn those permanents into an artifact as well. Next is going to be Jin-Kataxis, another solid blue creature. I have always loved the Praetors. Jin-Kataxis has been my favorite for a long time. It has flash, and at the beginning of your end step, you're going to draw 7 cards, which is awesome. And at the beginning of each opponent's maximum hand size is now reduced by 7. So if they don't have a unlimited hand size at all, they actually have to discard their entire hand at the end of their turn. Now that's really taxing on them, and again, I cannot stress this enough. I'm only saying that I play this card for a competitive purpose. This is not a casual way to play. This is not a have fun with friends kind of way. This is literally meant to just be as mean and win as possibly as fast as you can with this deck. The last creature I'm going to run is Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. Everybody should know this card by now. It's been around for a long time. It's a 12/12. When you cast it, you draw 4 cards. You have Annihilator 4 on it, which means whenever it attacks, the defending player is going to sacrifice that many permanents. And whenever it's put into a graveyard from anywhere, you shuffle it into your library along with the rest of your graveyard. Now, that last ability is essentially why we run the card at all. I mean, you could, in theory, run Ulamog, and the old Ulamog, that is, and be just as well off, but I happen to like Kozilek just a little bit more, just for flavor. Next, I just want to mention the only Planeswalker I run, and surprisingly enough, it's not Jace the Mind Sculptor, it's actually Karn. Mind Sculptor, while he is a very, very good card, and I did run him for a while, I've usually found that he just sits there, I brainstorm with him, and then it's instant removal. Most of the time is what happens with him. Karn, on the other hand, he has a little bit more survivability to him. And not only that, but exiling target permanent the turn that he comes out is pretty handy in a deck that we're essentially just trying to control the game until we win. Next, I want to talk about the artifacts. Now, as far as the artifacts are concerned, I'm going to go in mana cost order again, or I'm not going to go in mana cost order here, but we're just going to touch base on a few of them because a lot of these are pretty well known, pretty easy to understand what they're in here for. So first, we're going to have our Gauntlet, Cage Sun, Extra Planner Lens. They all essentially do the same thing. They're all going to make me have extra mana. Cage Sun is the best case scenario for myself. Extra Planner Lens is the cheapest of them all, but it has the potential to help out my opponents. Next, we're going to have just some classic EDH artifacts that people run almost consistently in every deck that they play. Soul Ring, you see it almost all the time. It's just 1 mana for 2. You can't ask for more than that. As far as competitive EDH decks are concerned, you're going to see Sensei's tops pretty much everywhere you go. For 1, you get to look at the top 3 and put them back in any order, and you can tap it and then draw a card and then put Sensei's top back on top of its owner's library. Pretty nice. It has the ability to save itself in case if it's about to be removed. A pseudo Sensei's Dividing Top that I actually like to play a little bit more than top is Scroll Rack. Scroll Rack's a little bit of an older card. It costs 2 to put out. For 1, and you can tap it, choose any number of cards in your hand and set those cards aside. Put equal number of cards from the top of your library into your hand, then put the cards that you set aside on top of your library in any order. So this works really well if you need to be digging a lot more than you actually are, because top, I've found, unless if you're shuffling your library, you're typically, that first turn you play it, you get to go 3 deep, but after that, you're still just like normal, only going 1 card deeper than you would have before. Whereas Scroll Rack can dig even deeper if you happen to draw some cards, or if you even happen to shuffle. As far as drawing more cards, we're going to have a Howling Mine, a Font of Mythos, and a Temple Bell. All are just intended to help me draw more. Now, these do help my opponent, but I'm typically going to be working a little bit better when it comes to having more cards in my hand. My cards in my hand matter a lot more than my opponent's does. And a Isochron Scepter is a pretty interesting artifact that I actually really like to run for counterspells. Counterspells, generally in EDH, you can use the best ones that are out there with mana costs of, say, 0 or 2, which works perfectly well with the Isochron Scepter. So when you cast it, when it enters the battlefield, you can exile an instant sorcerer. You can exile an instant card with converted mana cost of 2 or less from your hand with Isochron Scepter, and you tap 2, tap it, and you can copy the exiled card. And if you do, you get to cast that card without paying its mana costs, all that kind of stuff. Pretty easy to get a free counterspell off of that, so it's just a counterspell on a stick. Or you could use it for, say, a tutor spell like Mystical Tutor. You can always search up the exact same card. You can search up similar cards and make sure that you always have one of those ready on hand. Crystal Ball I found pretty neat. I used to run a Thassa in the deck for scrying, but I found that Crystal Ball was a little bit better. For 1 mana and tapping, I get to scry 2. Scrying 2 is always better than scrying 1, and to be honest, I was only doing it once a turn with Thassa anyway, so I might as well do it once a turn with Crystal Ball. Vedalken Shackles, really excellent card in a mono blue deck, as you could possibly imagine. It's a 3-drop, and you can choose to not untap it during your untap step. For 2 and tap it, you can gain control of target creature with power less than or equal to the number of islands you control, as long as the shackles remain tapped. Get enough islands out there, and you can take even a World Spine Worm, which is pretty helpful. And one of my favorite artifacts ever printed is Library of Lang. Now, I happen to like multiplayer games. I love two-headed giant games. Now, Library of Lang has skip your discard phase. I don't know if you know this or not, but if you're in a two-headed giant game, you have Library of Lang out, you've just made your teammates no longer have a discard phase either. So you essentially both end up having infinite hand sizes. Now, the other added ability of it is whenever a spell or an effect forces you to discard a card, you can instead discard that card to the top of your library. So say someone comes out and they make you discard a card of any sort, whichever spell that they use. You could choose to, instead of putting that card in your graveyard, you can instead just put it on top of your library and then draw it again a little bit later, thus making any discard fashion pretty much null and void. Next, we're going to go through my enchantments. There's not very many of them, so this will go pretty quick. Take Possession, I liked a lot. It's quite expensive to put out there. However, it's enchant a permanent, any permanent. You're going to control that that permanent. But it also has Split Second, which means your opponents can't really respond to Take Possession. Leyline of Anticipation speaks for itself. It makes everything I have that isn't instant speed. Dictative Crew Fix goes up there with Howling Mine and Font of Mythos and Temple Bell. It just helps me draw more. Sphinx Tutelage is a way that I can punish my opponents for me drawing. So whenever I draw a card, I make them mill 2. If they share a color, they have to do it again. And you can imagine that that can get out of hand quite quickly with how many cards I'm going to be drawing during my game. Rhystic Study is one of those ways that I draw so much. It's a 3-drop, and whenever an opponent plays a spell, I may draw a card unless that player pays 1 colorless. It's one of the most unfair blue cards that a lot of people I've talked to about think. It's really hard. It's really taxing, and if you don't pay all the time, then your opponent's going to end up with such card advantage that it's going to be hard to even overcome that anymore. The last enchantment I have is Counterbalance. 2-drop, whenever an opponent plays a spell, you may reveal the top card of your library. If you do, counter that spell with the same converted mana cost as the revealed card. So you can imagine what I can do with this card whenever I have a Sensei's Top out or a Scroll Rack out, and I can put any card I want on top of the library and then just counter it by flipping it. Next, I want to go through the small stack of sorceries. These do happen to be in mana cost order, so we'll just keep with that, with first starting off with Personal Tutor. Search your library for a sorcery card, reveal it to everybody, and then shuffle it, put it on top. It's like most typical tutor cards. Sorceries to go grab are like extra turn cards, a whole bunch of drawing cards, things of that nature. Another card is going to be Ponder, just a general good draw card. Look at the top 3. If you don't like it, you can shuffle up and then draw a card. Curse of the Swine, X and blue. It's one of the better removal spells, sadly, for EDH. You can exile X target creatures. For each creature exiled this way, its controller gets a 2/2 green boar creature token onto the battlefield. Now, this is one of those times where the wording on the card really matters. So say you're trying to exile your opponent's commander. If the commander is not exiled with Curse of the Swine, they don't get that boar at the end of the day because they chose to redirect it and put it into the command zone. So this is one of those times where it really matters where that creature went when you targeted it with Curse of the Swine. Windfall, pretty solid. Makes it so that everybody can draw a bunch of cards. Say you load somebody up with a bunch of cards in their hand, or if you happen to have a lot, you can just discard all those cards, and then everybody's going to draw that amount. Now, if I have, say 30 or 40 cards in hand, but one of them is a Kozilek, I cast Windfall. I'm going to cast Windfall, I'm going to discard my hand, shuffle everything back in, and then I'm going to draw that amount, where that could potentially maybe mill out some of my opponents. Next is going to be a Time Warp, just standard. Target player takes an extra turn after this one. Pretty self-explanatory. Next is going to be a Recurring Insight. Draw cards equal the number of cards in target opponent's hand. It also has Rebound, so you're going to get to do this twice for casting it one time. Next up, we're going to have a Temporal Mastery. This is one of those cards you can search up with the Personal Tutor, or later a Mystical Tutor, which I'm about to show you. It's another take an extra turn card, but it has that awesome ability of, if it's the first card you drew, you can reveal it, pay 2, as its miracle cost states, and then you get to cast it for that 2, instead of the full 7 that it actually costs. And next is going to be Beacon of Tomorrows. One of the better take an extra turn cards. It's 8. I know it's a little bit taxing, but as soon as it resolves, it doesn't even hit the graveyard. It goes straight into your library again, shuffles up. So if you put a Personal Tutor on that Isochron Scepter that I showed you, you can get infinite turns this way as long as you have enough mana, which I believe this is 8, so 9, 10, 11. So for 11 mana, you got infinite turns from here on out. And last but not least, we're going to go through my instants. My instants are in mana cost order here, so we'll try to stick with them. I want to keep in mind, though, that most of these are just counter spells. If there's something special about it, I'll mention it, but just keep in mind that these are counter spells for the most part. When they're not counter spells, they're just more draw or more ways to control the game. So, Pact of Negation, 0 cost counterspell. You need to pay 5 at the beginning of the next upkeep, or else you're going to lose the game after you cast this. But it's that way, if you don't have enough land untapped, you can still counter whatever's happening. Mystical Tutor, you can search for an instant or sorcery. of any sort in your library and then put it on top after you've shuffled it. It's one of those things that you can attach to an Isochron Scepter, and I just realized that Personal Tutor on Isochron Scepter I was talking about earlier you cannot do because Personal Tutor is the sorcery. Mystical Tutor, on the other hand, you can't put on Isochron Scepter. So if you have Mystical Tutor, Isochron Scepter, and Beacon of Tomorrows, and along with that amount of mana, then you can get your infinite turns. I apologize. Brainstorm. One of the best draw cards that is legal. It's 1, draw 3, put 2 back on top. Reality Shift, another removal card that you have for EDH, just for blue in general. Blue doesn't really have that much for removal. We typically only have bounce, but Reality Shift was a godsend when it came. For 2 mana, just exile target creature, and then they get to manifest the top. Now, of course, a lot of bad things can happen with that manifest card, but more times than not, they're going to be manifesting like a land, or a sorcery, or an instant, or an enchantment, or an artifact that isn't a creature in their deck. So more times than not, it's worth using that Reality Shift on, say, like a huge creature that's going to kill you next turn. Disdainful Stroke, 2 mana counterspell. That spell needs to cost 4 or greater, but that happens a lot in EDH, so it's pretty safe to throw this in there and say you're going to have a use for it a little bit later. Arcane Denial, great counterspell. It's just going to counter it flat out for a colorless and a blue. However, on the next upkeep, whoever's turn it is, at that upkeep, your opponent gets to draw 2, and you can draw 1. But, again, you are still flat out countering a spell for a colorless and a blue. That's kind of hard to argue with that. Let them have the extra card advantage, because whatever you were countering was probably worth it. Next up is just straight counterspell. 2 blue, doesn't get better than that. Cyclonic Rift, very overpowered card in EDH, especially in multiplayer, because for 7 mana, you can lift everybody's non-land permanents off the field. Every single one of them gone, and it's really hard for a lot of people to come back from that. But of course, you still have the regular mode of paying 2 and then just bouncing 1 permanent. Pulse of the Grid, now I will admit that this isn't one of those great cards like I was talking about in the beginning of the video where I'm just only playing what I can to win. Pulse of the Grid, though, it's pretty nice. It works well in the mirror matchup if you're working against somebody else that is also a draw combo deck. If they have a lot of cards in hand, Pulse of the Grid is going to help you out a lot because you can, for 3, you're going to draw 2 and then discard a card. Then, draw 2, discard 1. If an opponent has more cards in hand, you return Pulse of the Grid from the graveyard back to your hand. So it's going to help you out a lot. Blue Suns, X, 3 blue, target player draws X cards, shuffle it in. Self-explanatory, especially when you have infinite mana. Capsize, it's 3 to bounce target permanent. And if you pay an extra 3, you get to put Capsize back into your hand after it resolves. Pretty nice. Dissipate, one of the better 3-costing counterspells in my opinion. For a colorless and 2 blue, you can target spell, counter target spell. If it was countered this way, exile it instead of putting it in its owner's graveyard. Pretty handy, especially for those pesky spells like Eldrazi that you don't want hitting that graveyard if you're going for the mill route. Another version of that card essentially is just Void Shatter. Void Shatter is technically colorless, but it's same cost, does the same thing, and in my opinion it actually has a little bit of a cooler art to it. I love the art on Void Shatter. Another 3-drop counterspell we have is Forbid. Costs 3 to counter target spell, just like the other ones I was talking about. However, instead of exiling it, it doesn't. Just puts in the graveyard. However, this card happens to have buyback. And with all the cards that we're going to be able to drawing, we're going to be able to pay that buyback of discarding 2 cards from your hand easily. So, counter target spell, discard 2 cards, put it back in the hand, and just keep going over and over again. One of the better counter spells that has ever been printed for other formats is Cryptic Command. For 4 mana, you get to choose 2. Counter target spell, bounce a permanent, tap all creatures your opponents control, or draw a card. Typically, you're going to be doing the counter draw, but in some cases, it does make sense to counter and tap all of your opponent's creatures because it's going to save you a little bit of damage if they're going to be coming at you for a lot that turn. Onto the 4-drop ones, we have Rewind. 4-cost counter target spell, untap up to 4 lands. So essentially, this particular counter spell could basically say it costs nothing. However, if you have a mana doubler out there, all of a sudden you can tap your lands, rewind, untap 4 lands, all of a sudden you've just ramped through a counterspell. What a green thing to do with a blue card. Next is Overwhelming Denial. One of those counters target spell can't be countered. I don't really run Last Word anymore, but I do run this because I have the ability for this to cost 2 mana if I played something else in that turn. So say I happen to Pact of Negation something earlier. Then they have another spell coming out. Well, I happen to have 2 islands open, so I can surge cost Overwhelming Denial and make sure that my opponent's really staying down and not getting anything that they want on that turn. The last 4-drop one is going to be Mindbreak Trap. It's not technically a counter spell, it's actually a little bit better. If your opponent has played 3 or more spells this turn, you can pay 0 rather than playing its 4-drop mana cost. But you exile any number of target spells that are on the stack at that given time. So basically, for all those cards that say that they can't be countered, for instance, like my Sphinx, if you cast Mindbreak Trap, you actually exile it off the stack. It isn't technically countered, but it's no longer on the stack. Kind of hurts your opponents a little bit when they were expecting to really get that one thing that they knew wouldn't be countered by you. Kind of hard to have a mono blue EDH deck without a Force of Will. It's just a free counter spell for paying 1 life and exiling a blue card out of your hand. You could pay the 5 if you want to, but the whole entire reason to run Force is to be able to counter something without having mana open. A pseudo counter spell that I run, it's not really a counter spell again, but it's called Time Stop. For 6 mana, you just end the turn. That's it. Anything that was on the stack before you cast Time Stop is then going to be removed from the stack. That's just kind of how it is. Kind of hard to say that that's not one of the most OP counter spells to actually run, because it's going to do essentially the same thing that the Mindbreak Trap did, which is countering the uncounterable. The last card I run in this deck is going to be a Dig Through Time. Pretty easy, self-explanatory to say why I run this. It's 8 to cast, yeah, but it has Delve, and I create a lot of mana usually. Look at the top 7 of your library, put the 2 best cards of those 7 into your hand, and then the rest on the bottom. So that is my competitive EDH deck. Please give me any comments on this video for what videos you guys want to see next. Again, you can get at me at my Twitter handle at @paragon_19 with a capital P. Throw me suggestions, you can shoot me questions, whatever you want. Thanks for watching, guys.
What's up, and thanks for watching this video. I produce all different kinds of content, so if you haven't yet, click on my face to subscribe. If you want to watch more videos, I've got some sweet playlists, including this one, where I open up every fat pack ever created. I've also got this one over here where I open just about anything vintage and old and expensive for your enjoyment. And all this is made possible by the awesome backers at our Patreon, which is linked in the description of every video. Hop on over there, check it out, see if it's something you might want to consider. If not, sit back, enjoy, and I'll still love you.